good to be here with you. I'm sure most of you know Charles Gessert, who's been talking to me about coming up here and giving a talk to this group for, I think, almost 20 years. Yeah, finally. That is definitely, and he's definitely persistent. Charles and I worked together at the Medical College of Wisconsin back in the early and mid 90s, trying to transform a family medicine residency training program that was associated with St. Mary's Hospital, where I had worked for a number of years, to improve its ability to care for people living in poverty. It was a clinic that served, I don't know, about 3,000 families in the central city of Milwaukee. And it was a residency. And so we had to manage and balance the interests and concerns of a bunch of residents. And I don't know if any of you have ever worked at a daycare center, but there's aspects of raising residents that does sometimes remind me of having to corral a bunch of 5-year-olds and make sure that they all get safely in and out of the playground. But it was about a 5-year program that we did together, and it was under the auspices of a Catholic health system called the Daughters of Charity National Health System. It's now called Ascension. I don't think there are any Ascension entities up here in the Minnesota area. They're a huge health system. I think they're the second largest Catholic health system in the country. Back then, they were also pretty large. And we worked with that group. We worked a lot with a number of the sisters who are a particular kind of Catholic that I might talk a little bit about here as I share my comments with you. But Charles had asked me to talk about the mission of Catholic healthcare in the context of where we are today in this country and in this society, and that presumes there is a mission, and I will suggest that there are missions in Catholic healthcare, and there are missions in the Catholic tradition, and they don't all agree with one another. I've been a Catholic for 7 decades. I was born a Catholic. Went through Catholic grade school on the west side of Chicago with a bunch of sisters, some of whom may have needed psychiatric assistance because they, after trying to manage 64 kids in a room and you're like 19 years old, I think it caused a fair amount of PTSD before we even knew it was PTSD. I went to a seminary. I was actually going to become a Catholic priest for about 5 years. I thought that was a good idea. And then as I got older, I realized more about what celibacy really means. And it wasn't just going to be for me. And so I left. The other reason I left was because the rector of the seminary was unhappy with a bunch of us because we had rented a bus and we were going to drive it down to Selma, Alabama in March. And he thought that might get him in trouble with our parents. I mean, we were college kids by then, but there was a concern about becoming that socially active, at least in that particular community. So he canceled our trip. And that, plus Patricia Radcliffe, who I'd been hanging out with a little bit too much, convinced me that maybe I shouldn't submit to a life of being a priest. Now, I don't mean to suggest that for some that isn't a wonderful way of living and serving, because there are some truly remarkable people in that line of work, but that turned out to not be for me. When I look at my sort of history as a Catholic, I divide it up into a series of the times. So that my first 25 years of being a Catholic were pretty serious Catholic. I mean, I went to church every day if I could. I was very involved in service in my parish. That was the days of the Vatican II Council. Those of you who maybe have paid attention to that kind of an event historically, it was very transformational in the Catholic tradition. We went from an organization worldwide that was very insular, very self-absorbed, very, very conservative and traditional, to something that had at least the possibilities of becoming much more progressive, much more inclusive of other perspectives, and more ecumenical. Any of you who might have been participants in the various denominations back in those days may have experienced some of that openness to not only hanging out with your own kind and being a particular kind of insular Catholic. It was also a time for much more social activism. The Vatican II Council opened up the doors and the windows for new ideas and new approaches to things. There were efforts to change the position of the church on birth control. There were quite a few efforts to really put our money where our mouth was in terms of peace and justice. And so as the Vietnam War warmed up and became a major issue, many Catholic priests and bishops and sisters became very active in the anti-war movement and motivated many of us laypersons to participate in protests and active sorts of efforts to address the war. It didn't help me because I got drafted and I had to go in back in '68. But in that period of time, I got a lot of support and guidance to consider becoming a conscientious objector. There were, I'm not suggesting that everybody in the Catholic tradition back in the early and mid '60s was a raving liberal. And in fact, there was a very strong and very polarized kind of dialogue that went on back in those days, where individuals on different parts of the continuum, at different levels of the Catholic Church, particularly in the United States, had very different experiences of the war and of the position that we should be taking on the war, our position on supporting the government versus not supporting the government. And those issues, those conflicts, that polarization has echoed through the years. I mean, I have this sense today that the debates between traditional conservative Catholics and liberal Catholics, progressive Catholics, they remind me a lot of the debates that we had back in the '60s and '70s. Now, I think they're more concerning today than they were back then, if that's at all possible. There's a level of debate and a level of polarization that's occurring today that I don't remember occurring back in those days. But that was sort of the first phase of my life as a practicing Catholic. The second phase, it was a phase when I began having a family, began being preoccupied with raising children. It was also a time of the growth of feminism and of changes in the relationships between men and women in our society, and some of that ran up against some of the more traditional perspectives of the Catholic tradition on the role of women, all of the issues of sexuality, all the issues involved in family planning, abortion. It was a very intense period of time for many of us who considered ourselves dissenting Catholics, questioning Catholics, wondering about whether we could stay engaged as Catholics. So there was a time there when many people left the faith and left participating on a regular basis in the church, so that there were gaps in voices. And at the same time, we had a new pope, a couple of new popes actually during that period of time, who were, I think most people would say, more conservative than John the 23rd was at the time of the Vatican Council. And these new popes had more conservative views about many of the things that people were arguing about and debating about. And consequently, people thought, well, I'm not sure I want to be on this train anymore. I'm going to get off and do something else. For myself, I became more disengaged. Ironically, it was at a time when I became employed in Catholic healthcare and became, over time, a Catholic ethicist, working at the front lines of issues in healthcare that had implications for religiously sponsored organizations. I had to participate in interpreting and applying directives, for instance, that were reflected different aspects of the Catholic tradition, some of which I didn't personally agree with, but in a Catholic hospital, in a Catholic context, were expected, that we had to apply in various ways. And that was a long period of time of learning how to navigate through the minefields of Catholic moral ethics and medical ethics. There were a lot of very challenging cases that were developed during that time around end-of-life care, around legal positions that were being taken by the Supreme Court relative to how to care for people at the end of life, and issues of discontinuing life support and so forth. And then at the same time, across the country, the whole movement towards what some people call physician-assisted suicide, what other people call aid in dying, or death with dignity. Those were all percolating. Those were the kinds of things I was dealing with on a day-to-day basis in the various organizations I worked in. And at that time, again, there was polarization. There was individuals on different points in the continuum dealing with these various issues. At one time, I worked at a hospital in Southwest Missouri, in Springfield, Missouri. There were three Catholic parishes in Springfield, Missouri. There were 600 Assembly of God communities in Springfield, Missouri. There was one synagogue, and the rabbi was a woman who basically supported three different variations on Judaism somehow or another. She was an amazing, amazing woman. But here we were, a 800-bed hospital, Catholic-sponsored, Sisters of Mercy-sponsored hospital, serving, I don't know, 90% of the community that we served were not Catholic. I'm not sure how many were free thinkers in the sense of this group, but it was a very welcoming, very open kind of community with very defined ideas about faith and about how to live out one's faith. And here was this big Catholic enterprise presenting, implementing positions that weren't necessarily agreed by all the members of that community. So it was a formative experience for me to be in that particular kind of community over the years. After that period of time, then I'd say for the last 25 years or so, I have been experiencing an intensification of the polarization that's occurring both within my particular field of work, Catholic healthcare, as well as the broader community. And when I understand that you, some of you talked about a book called Playing God a couple of months ago, which just sort of describes some of the movement that has occurred in the sort of geopolitics of religion and politics across different denominations in the U.S. And that's had implications for the care we provide in hospitals in terms of how we implement various ethical and religious directives, what kinds of positions that we can take in terms of caring for our patients and our communities. But very intense emotions that are being expressed these days in a way that I didn't experience 25 years ago or more. And one of the things that I have come across to help me sort of make sense of all of this in terms of the dichotomies and the polarizations and so forth is something called Catholic social teaching. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of that term, but Catholic social teaching, so there's actually a book out about it called Our Best Kept Secret. Because, I mean, like I said, I've been a Catholic my whole life, and I didn't really run into Catholic social teaching until I was in my 50s. It just wasn't something people talked about. If you drill down into what exactly does that mean, it sort of explains why it's maybe one of our best kept secrets, because it's a fairly radical set of principles about how to be committed to the needs of the world we live in and the communities that we live in. One of the principles is respect for the human person. Now, that can be interpreted as, anti-abortion, but that's a very, I think, limited way of thinking about that principle. Respect for the human person is also about equity. It's about freedom of expression. It's about letting people be who they are. It's about all the stuff we talk about when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and welcoming. It really advocates for opening up and widening the welcoming of people of different faiths and no faith and all the other kinds of ways of thinking about how to be a fulfilled human being. A second principle that's significant is the principle of the common good. That we are obligated to focus on what's best for the people of our community and not just what's best for us as individuals. And that sometimes that's a sacrifice. But that in order to have a community where everyone has an opportunity to flourish and become who they are, you have to focus on what's in the best interest of everybody and the common good. A third principle is the principle preferential option for the poor. Preferential option for the poor, which says they're first. They're at the front of the line. They're not the last thing we think about. They're the first thing we think about. There was a bishop in Michigan when I was working in Michigan in Saginaw, who for a period of time, 1 year, said every single meeting that we start in this diocese at the parish level or at the diocesan level has to start with the question, what's this meeting going to do for the poor people in our community? What's it going to do for the vulnerable in our community? There aren't a lot of bishops that start their meetings that way. But he was one in particular who really invited people to turn that question about the preferential option for the poor into a reality. Now, in Catholic healthcare over the years, that was my experience, that we did many different things to demonstrate that was a principle that that really we wanted to live by and demonstrate our commitment to. It was a struggle because it isn't an inexpensive thing to put your money where your mouth is when it comes to the preferential option for the poor. But that was a core Catholic social teaching that we were expected to live by. There are about 9 principles, but the main ones, in terms of at least my experience in Catholic healthcare, were those 3. So here we are today in 2024 in anticipation of a very crucial election. And what are the implications of this election for the Catholic religion that says that it has a commitment to these core principles: respect for the human person, the common good, and a preferential option for the poor? I think those principles are being challenged significantly by this election. And I think they're being challenged very, very specifically by Trump as an individual potential leader of this country again. And by this larger city, sort of, I don't know if it's an ideology or not, but this whole issue of Trumpism and how it's being manifested across the spectrum of individuals who support that group of leaders who will implement those elements of what Trumpism is about if they should get back into power again. So what's the challenge to a Catholic organization, and what's the implications for a Catholic organization, given that we say, as a Catholic community, that we're committed to care for the poor, that we're committed to the common good, that we're committed to respecting all the different aspects of what it means to be a human person. I think it's very challenging. And unfortunately, not everybody who considers themselves a practicing Catholic thinks that this is such a bad deal. That maybe someone like Trump is going to be the answer to a lot of their concerns. Look what he's done. He's replaced the Supreme Court's got 7 Catholics on it. I don't know if any of you remember when John F. Kennedy was running for president, you would have thought the world was going to come to an end if we elected a Catholic to be president. And now we have 7 Supreme Court justices who are Catholic. And they're not liberal, well, 6 of them are not liberal Catholics. I mean, it still kind of blows my mind that we could have a situation where that many very conservative Catholics could be sitting on the Supreme Court. 3 of them are there because Trump got them there. There are those kinds of implications going down the path. I mean, I don't want to get us all riled up here, but I suppose I could just do a litany of, or an inventory of all the other implications of this election if he were to win again. But from a Catholic perspective, and I'm a liberal progressive Catholic who has a background in ethics and moral theology, and so I'm sort of dangerous with what I know and what I do. And I think those of us like me are we're being really, there's a demand on us to challenge and speak out and question respectfully in some cases the positions of some of our fellow Catholics around how do you support this individual? How do you support these policies and these practices? That whole question about talking about 14 million people being sent away. What about the facts? What about some of the things that we know are going to happen if this individual becomes president again? Basically, this is what I wanted to share with you to start us off on a conversation. I hope that that's sufficient to generate some questions and some comments. I would rather that we talk with one another as opposed to me continuing to, and if I have I've said something that needs further elaboration, please ask me to do so. But that's a wonderful question. He's asked whether the fact that I do ethics and I can call myself an ethicist, does that mean in fact that I'm an ethicist? It really does kind of ruin you. You can't shoplift anymore if you say you're an ethicist. I mean, it's just sort of it's just not something you can do, right? I think that it's sad to say. I mean, I think I'm an ethical person. I think I'm a moral person. But I think you could do some of what I do, and not be at least ethical, maybe in the way you think a person should be ethical. One of the problems with doing ethics work is I've always said you should have a therapist and you should have a spiritual director when you're an ethicist, because you can kind of get taken up with this. Oh, gee, I'm sitting around talking with people about discontinuing life support. That's a significant human experience to be having, and you can get kind of thinking, oh, gee, I'm kind of a cool person because I get to do that kind of work. That pride, and I mean, so I think that if there's a quality I really hope an ethicist has, it's the quality of humility, to know that and someone was talking earlier. Oh, the reflection really was about, I heard that it was to some extent about assumptions we have. There are assumptions we have that really need to be brought out and called out, and that's, well, we need to have people around us who are not afraid to say we're full of poop. That we really need to be questioned. There are other assumptions that have us. Those are the worst and most dangerous kinds of assumptions, because we think we know. We think we know. There's a saying that I think Mark Twain said, that the biggest mistake isn't not knowing something. It's knowing something that isn't true and thinking it's true. Does that answer?
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
2 questions. One is, given the concern about the well-being of the poor, why historically were Catholic countries where the major religion was Catholicism, poorer than those that were Protestant, say in Europe or in the Western Hemisphere? And the other question is, what is the Catholic doctrine about natural law? Because we're told that all sorts of, say, sexual practices violate natural law. So what is natural law and how do you know what it is? It's not published in the code of law.
Well, the first question, I mean, I think that's a very good question in the sense of how is it that there have, generally speaking, been more, let's say, more success in recruiting people to the Catholic faith who live in poverty. You know, a wonderful study of the historical Jesus, written quite a few years ago now by John Dominic Crossan. It's called the Mediterranean Peasant Revolutionary. I mean, Jesus was this very poor peasant who had this very appealing argument that was very attractive to people who, like him, lived in poverty and were oppressed by Romans and by the restrictions of the Jewish faith at the time. And he was able to break through that and attract people to follow him because he was a poor man who spoke about issues that they could relate to. And you know, it's funny, the seminary that I went to was preparing me to become a missionary. And if I had gone through the other 8 years of training, I would have been sent to Central or South America, most likely, to serve the needs of people in those countries. So I think this historically, it's just the way things have been for many years. But I also think the gospel story, is very appealing to people who are in that who are living in poverty because it resonates with them. Now it can backfire because they're in the history of care for the poor and proselytizing to the poor. I think some poor people have been kept poor, and that's a real issue. Now the other question you had, I was hoping nobody would ask me that question. Natural law is a very strong foundational theological ethical model in the Catholic tradition, which suggests that you look at the world, you look at the natural world, and you see things being done a certain way or not being done a certain way, and you deduce from them that's the way we should be as humans. We should follow the natural law because God crafted the natural law when God created, men and women and Adam and Eve and all that scriptural justification for early theology.
A quick follow-up.
Yeah.
So masturbation seems to be something you would see if you had God's eyes all the time, but yet it's spelled to be a violation of natural law. So how is the natural law isn't being derived from the actual practice in the world?
That's a good question, and the answer that I am remembering hearing, because we all asked that question when we were kids, or at least some of us asked that question. There's this thing called procreative and unitive function of the sexual relationship. We're supposed to do it the way it's done in nature, without any interference, and we're supposed to be able to do it so that it will result in the procreation of life. So that particular moral theological principle, which was developed back, I don't know, 200-300 after Christ, was really designed as a population control mechanism, because there were groups of early Christians who were saying we shouldn't have sex, we should be celibate, and they were worried about them all dying out because that's what's going to happen if nobody produces any children. So they came up with that whole idea of procreative and unitive to try to encourage people to have sex. So, I mean, I'm being I'm oversimplifying this to some extent, but
Second, you said, and I agree, in the 60s, we had the same debates in very broad strokes. And it didn't concern us too much. And this is not surprising because we were winning. And over the next several decades, my dad's generation went crazy, biting their nails and upset and outraged as we became more and more in charge, us liberals. We passed laws about gays and black people and women and all kinds of deplorables, according to the other side. Now it's not our turn anymore. We're having the same debate, but it's not our turn. They're going to take over either in November or January. And I'm calling on us to handle this with considerably more grace than we are now.
That might be one of the ways that we temper the violence that's being threatened as a result, and the retribution that's being. I mean, I sometimes listen to Trump and think I'm reading the Old Testament. That he's some old prophetic guy talking about burning Sodom and Gomorrah down, which is a real ironic thing for Trump to be saying. So, but I think that's. I think we have to figure out a way not to turn the other cheek, although that's what some people might say, but we have to figure out a way to deal with the intensity of emotion that is being provoked so that maybe we can figure out a way to navigate through this if that happens.
John.
I'm going to skip the politics. I'm really interested in end of life. You mentioned that.
Yeah.
I've read up on it a little bit, and Catholic hospitals are a big part of the narrative of how people feel about handling that. You can't, if you end up in a Catholic hospital and then you say, we want to pull the plug, most of them won't, as far as I know. Anyway, my question is, how do you see the doctrines of Catholics squaring ever with something like that? That possible?
Well, it depends on how that is implemented.
Yeah,
for sure. I mean, if it looks like we are accelerating the dying of an individual, so that they're going to die sooner rather they're dying, but they're going to die sooner rather than later because they want to die sooner rather than later. The current Catholic interpretation is that is a form of euthanasia. Now, I was working in California before I came back to Wisconsin for a number of years during the time when the aid in dying law was passed, and we were figuring out that law so we were for our patients, not abandoning them, providing them with palliative care and hospice care, dealing with their symptoms and their discomfort. And if they elected to use the law, the aid in dying law, which is to say, get someone to provide them with a cocktail that they could take to accelerate their dying, we weren't going to, abandon them, and we weren't going to knock it out of their hands or prevent them from using that. We weren't going to give it to them, but we had individuals who they had access to, who would provide them with that. I've been involved in discontinuing life support decisions for 40 years at Catholic institutions. We don't get in the way of someone who's dying so that they're not going to die. We don't slow their dying process down. We don't interfere with that because that's not part of the Catholic position either. I'm going to let him ask first, Charles. So, but it's a very, I consider it a sacred moment when we're working with families and patients on this particular issue, so that we don't screw it up, and so that they, that they aren't suffering. And now there are situations. I don't know what the law is in Minnesota, but in Wisconsin, where I'm now working, we can't support someone in terms of aid and dying. The laws prevent us from doing that in Wisconsin now. So it's not really a Catholic issue at the moment. It's a state legislature issue. Does that answer?
Yeah, pretty much that you were able to do that in a Catholic hospital.
Yeah, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, could you
So yeah,
summarize that?
I'm gonna, yeah. So what I hear you saying is, you had this experience of a conversation with someone who was basically um, affirming in a positive way that suffering at the end of life might be uh, a good thing for that person. I'm oversimplifying maybe, but that's sort of what you were saying. And it reminded me of a patient I worked with who expressed that. She was dying of a disease that was literally skinning her alive. Horribly painful, an awful, awful experience. And she was terminally ill, and she was insisting on not getting any pain medicine. She did not want any assistance at all in the dying process because suffering was going to redeem her. She was sure that she was going to go to hell if she didn't experience this suffering unimpeded. And I remember saying to her, "You are in hell. You are literally dying from a disease that is the equivalent of burning alive. You're paying your dues right now." I mean, the chaplains would probably have said I didn't handle that very well, but it just sort of struck me that how kind of crazy that was for someone to think that suffering under those circumstances was going to be what she had to pay for.
What sacrifice?
Someone would say that that the story of Jesus suffering is the story of Jesus suffering for all of our sins, right? That's the story, and and so it justifies his suffering on behalf of all the rest of us. So some people give it up for all of us. They believe that their suffering is doing some good for the rest of us in some fashion. That's I think a very kind of way of thinking about your suffering. But I think our job in healthcare, Catholic healthcare in particular, is to palliate and to provide people with comfort care when they're suffering from pain and other kinds of distressing symptoms. Now, if someone can refuse that for themselves, I really am uncomfortable when someone's loved one refuses that for them. But if they're choosing not to take pain medications for some reason or another, that's their choice. So I got to get to Charles, else he's not going to feed me lunch.
Well, for a second, I'll pretend that you and I haven't had endless conversations. I'd like to follow up on that. You mentioned natural law, and now we've gotten talking about things right here. It seems to me that many of the things that we do in the hospital are not natural. And if we could reconcile a little bit the use of natural law as a standard, and then the denial of the ability of the individual to refuse care. Let's say that they are on dialysis, that euthanasia, discontinue their respirator, which is a violent intervention, unnatural in their life. At what point does natural law trump these other considerations?
So how do you summarize what you just said for the folks on? I mean, when I hear you say,
Natural law,
see, couldn't we allow natural law so that it helps people die a peaceful death? I think it does. I think it does. I think natural law does not say, because it isn't natural to say you've got to continue to suffer until your last breath. I think it doesn't say we're going to put you out of your misery, though. That natural law would be if you interpreted natural law, they would say no, you can't aid someone in accelerating their dying process, but you can do whatever it takes to keep them comfortable. And also, natural law doesn't say you have to keep them alive at all costs. You don't have to keep them on a ventilator if they're dying. You don't have to keep them on dialysis if they don't want to be on dialysis anymore. What? The pacemaker, he's giving me these signals and I'm trying to. We actually talked about this case recently of the pacemaker. Some people want us to discontinue the pacemaker. Some people think, oh my gosh, you can't do that, they'll die. Well, you can a person, if they can express their wishes either directly or through a surrogate decision maker, say, take me off of this ventilator. I do not want to be on this ventilator anymore. And we'll take them off the ventilator. Someone says, I want this pacemaker turned off. We're supposed to turn off that pacemaker and not consider it assisted suicide or accelerating their dying process. We all have a right to make good decisions for ourselves. I think the gentleman in the back was then you and then you. Okay. Yes. Did you have your hand up? Oh, somebody back there I thought did. Yes. Not a gentleman though. Yes. Right. Yes. Yes, that's the term that's used. Thank you. That's the ethical and religious directives that you're referring to. Yeah. Okay, sir.
I got two comments, regarding this subject. I had a brother that passed away a few years ago from MS. And he had the time to really think out how he was going to pass. And so he went into the time when he thought the time had come. He went into hospice. He quit eating and drinking, but allowed himself to be medicated so that he didn't suffer.
Mm-hmm.
And he controlled his own passing. So that was something that stuck in me. And the other thing I was going to talk about is when my wife and I were married, I was raised Lutheran, my wife was Catholic. And we were raised by married by a fantastic priest. And after we were married, he quit the Catholic Church and got married and have a family of his own. And so that got me to thinking, is the Catholic Church starting to evolve to rethink a lot of these positions, such as priests being married? Because I think I read someplace 1,000 years ago, priests could be. And are they going to come full circle and start to reconsider and become more liberal? Our current pope seems to be a pretty enlightened guy.
Mm-hmm. So the question really is it possible that there will come a time when priests can be married again? And is the experience of this person who married you and your wife a sign that maybe that is happening? So I'll answer that question first. I don't think his leaving the priesthood and getting married. I mean, there were a lot of people doing that, and a lot of people still do that from time to time. People do leave the priesthood and lead another kind of life. That's just something that has happened more, I would say, more frequently in the last 50, 60 years. But I don't think I would interpret that as a sign that things are loosening up in terms of married priests. And although I think Pope Francis is very, relatively speaking, progressive when it comes to a lot of these kinds of issues, he's been pretty emphatic about that, at least up until recently. It's kind of hard to tell because he sometimes sends out differing messages, but he just was very emphatic about not allowing women to become ordained deacons or priests, which was, I think, a lot of people were hoping he might consider that. But the Catholic Church changes very, very slowly. You know, like we think a couple of months is slow, and they think 300 years is slow. It just, so who knows? I don't expect that we're going to have married priests the way you're describing it. And then now you can become a married priest today if you were an Episcopalian and move over to become a Catholic priest. But that's a very unusual sort of circumstance. So you had your hand up. Yeah.
I had a question, Colin, about this, this Catholic healthcare directive would apply to all Catholic hospitals.
Clinics and nursing homes, yeah.
It applies to everyone, whether they're Catholic or not. Those settings. And allowing to push it further, that you practice privileges, that the physician practice must also accept those healthcare directives. You confirm that they're pushing it beyond just Catholic and Catholic.
Well, that's actually been the situation for as long as I've been doing this work. A physician in a Catholic organization is expected to abide by the ethical and religious directives. Now, there are some exceptions that it can be arranged. So if he or she is not a full-time physician and practices at another setting that's not a Catholic setting, they can do some things they wouldn't be able to do in their clinic at the hospital or at the clinic that is owned by the hospital. So it's to some extent a function of the territory they practice in, but with one exception, and that is abortion. A physician who's employed by a Catholic organization who has a day of the week where he or she isn't employed cannot do abortions on that day off, so to speak. That's something that's is held as a sort of a restriction that covers them as long as they're employed. Is that clear? Now, I mean, it's maybe not. It does restrict.
Healthcare services, those are not.
It restricts, yes, it restricts what well, I mean, a Catholic or a non-Catholic physician can't do certain things if he or she is employed at that institution. Now,
Even as privileges.
right, their privileges are going to reflect what they can and can't do. Oh, it's a hard thing for many people to accept, but I interview all new providers to the organization every Wednesday morning that show up. You know, physicians, nurse practitioners, PAs, and go over that so that they're sure, so they're clear. This is what you've signed up to be a part of. You know, because you don't want to be surprised by that.
We went locally here in St. Mary's, the woman that have a child and she must have her teeth tied. If you live with a child at St. Mary's, push her across the walkway. And there was one where they do sterilization. That's not the best healthcare.
That's I personally agree with you. Over the years, some of the adjustments that have made and exceptions that have been made have been, I guess you could say from the standpoint of the patient, the good news is she got to have what she was looking for, but in order to get it, they did that particular maneuver. You know, some people don't think that's the safest way to do things. I'm kind of losing track of hands here. What? Did you?
And I think it's a good thing that you have new fields in this church. But I'm very puzzled why you made it.
You know, it's It's a real good question. I think they've said that just about every time somebody's asked me a question here, because they're really all good questions. I am an outspoken Catholic. I feel like I have been able to make a contribution from within. It's sort of like being in a circle. And so as long as you're inside the circle, you can say and do certain things that need to be said and done. You can get as close to the edge of that circle as you want to, but if you step out of that circle, you lose your voice. You lose your ability to influence. Like I've worked over the years with 25 bishops, and I have had remarkably honest and straightforward conversations with them, and they with me. I step out of the circle, and that's going to be harder for me to do. So, and so that's sort of my justification for staying in the group. Does that? Yeah.
You use the word redemption.
Redemptive suffering? Well, at least in the Christian tradition, not just the Catholic tradition, but in the Christian tradition, we're all sinners, right? We've all failed in some fashion. In fact, at one time, we failed the moment we were born. We were born with original sin. So you need to be redeemed of your sin. Well, there are all sorts of steps. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's, I think, probably why you're a free thinker in this room, right? Yeah. I mean, some of this stuff doesn't make any sense to people who don't believe it, right? I mean, and that comment or the discussion earlier about the facts. If you don't believe in redemption, there's a limited number of observable facts that one can be shown to demonstrate that that's a reality. Yeah.
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes? Yes.
Just interested in historical business standpoint. The Catholic hierarchy in the 80s and early 90s, from a growth and enrollment standpoint, did you feel threatened by the growth of the evangelical movement?
Well, I think it was noticed. When I think about articles I've read in the Catholic press and in the Catholic magazines, it has been noticed that there's a growing number of people leaving the Catholic practice and shifting over to an evangelical practice. Now, what's interesting is that there's a whole lot more evangelical Catholics than there used to be as well. And evangelicalism isn't just unique to a particular fundamentalist denomination, Protestant denominations. More and more evangelical Christian Catholics engaged in evangelicalism and fundamental Catholicism. So it may be that it'll even out. The question earlier about poor folks in some countries becoming Catholics, many of them are now becoming evangelicals because they're resonating with them more. Yeah. Any other? Yes. Well, what you're asking is there a way to address the hypocrisy of being saying you are a faith-based and faith-driven person, harming someone as you implement your faith? I think Jesus called them whitened sepulchres. I think the only few times that Jesus got angry in the Gospels was when he ran into people like that. Now, I don't know if that's a key, but I think one of the things we're going to have to do in the coming months is point out to a bunch of people who say they're following Jesus that they're not following Jesus. If they read the gospel, they would, that's talking about facts, assuming you agree with what the gospels have to say. Jesus is not promoting people, hurting other people with their religion, no matter what the religion is. So I suppose that's the last word. Huh?